Episode 11, Mark Twain's A Ghost Story. It is that time to prep for your day, motivate yourself to pick up around the house, or wind down for some much-needed R&R. I'm Lacey, and welcome to Let's Get Foxy, where we enjoy classic literature and have discussions about these stories, history, and more. Hello, everybody. With back to school just around the corner, I thought we could all use a fun story. You know, something to help get our stress down and to help the kids get a little bit more excited. And so I started looking through short stories on Gutenberg to see if I could find just the story. As I was scrolling, my husband got incredibly excited. So in our home, there is this tale that we hear probably a couple times a year, to be honest with you, where he describes the fact that he wasn't a model student in school. He had no interest in reading or doing any of his homework. And if you know the man now, you know that this man always has some kind of an audiobook going. So you're like, what? What do you mean? Well, it turns out that his mom had a friend of the family who was a retired teacher or professional tutor. And so she hooked my husband up with this woman to see if she could find a way to help spark his love of reading. And instead of having him read stuff that they were required to read in school, she went outside the box. She went to the classics. Shocker! Why would the classics work? Sorry, I love the classics. I know that everybody else is very much into book talk, but I'm a big classics fan, so I'm like, of course the classics worked. So now he loves to read. And when I was looking at it, I was like, oh my gosh, it's Mark Twain. Why not? Mark Twain is known for bringing fun and mischief into all of his stories. So I thought that could be a great fit for back to school. And it was fun for me because I actually hadn't read this particular story of Mark Twain's before now. So our story today is Mark Twain's A Ghost Story. It was published in 1875 and became part of Project Gutenberg in 2004. And before we get started, my son wanted the world to know that he is not a fan of this ghost story. He may be someday, but he is definitely not a fan today. But I still think it's a fun story for kids. So I hope that you enjoy the reading and stay tuned for the discussion afterward because our topic is a lot of fun. Before our book reading begins, I just wanted to take a minute to say this book is a snapshot of the past. This book may contain negative views and/or treatment of people and cultures. This was wrong then, and it is wrong now. Instead of blacklisting these novels, let's recognize the influence and learn from it. For, as the philosopher George Santayana said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Let's learn from the past to create a more inclusive future together. A Ghost Story by Mark Twain. I took a large room, far up Broadway, in a huge old building whose upper stories had been wholly unoccupied for years until I came. The place had long been given up to dust and cobwebs, to solitude and silence. I seemed groping among the tombs and invading the privacy of the dead. That first night I climbed up to my quarters. For the first time in my life, a superstitious dread came over me. And as I turned a dark angle of the stairway, and an invisible cobweb swung its slazy woof in my face and clung there, I shuddered as one who had encountered a phantom. I was glad enough when I reached my room and locked out the mold in the darkness. A cheery fire was burning in the grate, and I sat down before it with a comforting sense of relief. For 2 hours I sat there, thinking of bygone times, recalling old scenes and summoning half-forgotten faces out of the mists of the past, listening, in fancy, to voices that long ago grew silent for all time, and to once familiar songs that nobody sings now. And as my reverie softened down to a sadder and sadder pathos, the shrieking of the winds outside softened to a wail. The angry beating of the rain against the panes diminished to a tranquil patter, and one by one the noises in the street subsided, until the hurrying footsteps of the last belated straggler died away in the distance and left no sound behind. The fire had burned low. A sense of loneliness crept over me. I arose and undressed, moving on tiptoe about the room, doing stealthily what I had to do, as if I were environed by sleeping enemies whose slumbers it would be fatal to break. I covered up in bed, and lay listening to the rain and wind and the faint creaking of distant shutters, till they lulled me to sleep. I slept profoundly, but how long I do not know. All at once I found myself awake, and filled with a shuddering expectancy. All was still, all but my own heart. I could hear it beat. Presently the bedclothes began to slip away slowly toward the foot of the bed, as if someone were pulling them. I could not stir. I could not speak. Still the blanket slipped deliberately away till my breast was uncovered. Then, with a great effort, I seized them and drew them over my head. I waited, listened, waited. Once more that steady pool began, and once more I lay torpid, a century of dragging seconds till my breast was naked again. At last I roused my energies and snatched the covers back to their place and held them with a strong grip. I waited. By and by I felt a faint tug, and took a fresh grip. The tug strengthened to a steady strain. It grew stronger and stronger. My hold parted, and for the third time the blanket slid away. I groaned. An answering groan came from the foot of the bed. Beaded drops of sweat stood upon my forehead. I was more dead than alive. Presently, I heard a heavy footstep in my room. The step of an elephant, it seemed to me. It was not like anything human, but it was moving from me. There was relief in that. I heard it approach the door, pass out without moving bolt or lock, and wander away among the dismal corridors, straining the floors and joists till they creaked again as it passed. And then silence reigned once more. When my excitement had calmed, I said to myself, "This is a dream, simply a hideous dream." And so I lay thinking it over until I convinced myself that it was a dream. And then a comforting laugh relaxed my lips, and I was happy again. I got up and struck a light, and when I found that the locks and bolts were just as I had left them, another soothing laugh welled in my heart and rippled from my lips. I took my pipe and lit it, and was just sitting down before the fire when down went the pipe out of my nerveless fingers. The blood forsook my cheeks, and my placid breathing was cut short with a gasp. In the ashes on the hearth, side by side with my own bare footprint, was another, so vast that in comparison mine was but an infant's. Then I had had a visitor, and the elephant tread was explained. I put out the light and returned to bed, palsied with fear. I lay a long time, peering into the darkness and listening. Then I heard a grating noise overhead, like the dragging of a heavy body across the floor, then the throwing down of the body, and the shaking of my windows in response to the concussion. In distant parts of the building, I heard the muffled slamming of doors. I heard, at intervals, stealthy footsteps creeping in and out among the corridors, and up and down the stairs. Sometimes these noises approached my door, hesitated, and went away again. I heard the clanking of chains faintly in remote passages, and listened while the clanking grew nearer, while it warily climbed the stairways, marking each move by the loose surplus of chain that fell with an accented rattle upon each succeeding step as the goblin that bore it advanced. I heard muttered sentences, half-uttered screams that seemed smothered violently, and the swish of invisible garments, the rush of invisible wings. Then I became conscious that my bedchamber was invaded, that I was not alone. I heard sighs and breathings about my bed, and mysterious whisperings. 3 little spheres of soft phosphorescent light appeared on the ceiling directly over my head, clung and glowed there a moment, and then dropped, 2 of them upon my face and 1 upon the pillow. They spattered liquidly and felt warm. Intuition told me they had turned to gouts of blood as they fell. I needed no light to satisfy myself of that. Then I saw pallid faces, dimly luminous, and white uplifted hands, floating bodiless in the air, floating a moment and then disappearing. The whispering ceased, and the voices and the sounds and a solemn stillness followed. I waited and listened. I felt that I must have light or die. I was weak with fear. I slowly raised myself toward a sitting posture, and my face came in contact with a clammy hand. All strength went from me apparently, and I fell back like a stricken invalid. Then I heard the rustle of a garment. It seemed to pass to the door and go out. When everything was still once more, I crept out of bed, sick and feeble, and lit the gas with a hand that trembled as if it were aged with 100 years. The light brought some little cheer to my spirits. I sat down and fell into a dreamy contemplation of that great footprint in the ashes. By and by, its outlines began to waver and grow dim. I glanced up, and the broad gas flame was slowly wilting away. In the same moment, I heard that elephantine tread again. I noted its approach, nearer and nearer, along the musty halls, and dimmer the light waned. The tread reached my very door and paused. The light had dwindled to a sickly blue, and all things about me lay in a spectral twilight. The door did not open, and yet I felt a faint gust of air fan my cheek, and presently was conscious of a huge cloudy presence before me. I watched it with fascinated eyes. A pale glow stole over the thing. Gradually its cloudy folds took shape. An arm appeared, then legs, then a body, and last a great sad face looked out of the vapor. Stripped of its filmy housings, naked, muscular, and comely, the majestic Cardiff Giant loomed above me. All my misery vanished, for a child might know that no harm could come from that benignant countenance. My cheerful spirits returned at once, and in sympathy with them the gas flamed up brightly again. Never a lonely outcast was so glad to welcome company as I was to greet the friendly giant. I said, "Why, is it nobody but you? Do you know, I have been scared to death for the last 2 or 3 hours. I am most honestly glad to see you. I wish I had a chair. Here, don't try to sit down in that thing." But it was too late. He was in it before I could stop him, and down he went. I never saw a chair shivered so in my life. Stop, you'll ruin Too late again. There was another crash, and another chair was resolved into its original elements. Confound it! Haven't you got any judgment at all? Do you want to ruin all the furniture on the place? Here, you petrified fool! But it was no use. Before I could arrest him, he had sat down on the bed, and it was a melancholy ruin. Now what sort of a way is that to do? First you come lumbering about the place, bringing a legion of vagabond goblins along with you to worry me to death, and then when I overlook an indelicacy of costume which would not be tolerated anywhere by cultivated people, except in a respectable theater, and not even there if the nudity were of your sex, you repay me by wrecking all the furniture you can find to sit down on. And why will you? You damage yourself as much as you do me. You have broken off the end of your spinal column and littered up the floor with chips of your hams, till the place looks like a marble yard. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. You are big enough to know better. Well, I will not break any more furniture. But what am I to do? I have not had a chance to sit down for a century. And the tears came into his eyes. Poor devil, I said. I should not have been so harsh with you. And you are an orphan, too, no doubt. But sit down on the floor here. Nothing else can stand your weight. And besides, we cannot be sociable with you away up there above me. I want you down where I can perch on this high counting-house stool and gossip with you face to face. So he sat down on the floor and lit a pipe which I gave him, threw one of my red blankets over his shoulders, inverted my sitz-bath on his head, helmet fashion, and made himself picturesque and comfortable. Then he crossed his ankles while I renewed the fire, and exposed the flat honeycombed bottoms of his prodigious feet to the grateful warmth. What is the matter with the bottom of your feet and the back of your legs that they are gouged up so? Infernal chilblains! I caught them clear up to the back of my head roosting out there under Newell's farm. But I love the place. I love it as one loves his old home. There is no peace for me like the peace I feel when I am there. We talked along for half an hour, and then I noticed that he looked tired and spoke of it. Tired, he said. Well, I should think so. And now I will tell you all about it, since you have treated me so well. I am the spirit of the petrified man that lies across the street there in the museum. I am the ghost of the Cardiff Giant. I can have no rest, no peace, till they have given that poor body burial again. Now what was the most natural thing for me to do to make men satisfy this wish? Terrify them into it. Haunt the place where the body lay. So I haunted the museum night after night. I even got other spirits to help me, but it did no good, for nobody ever came to the museum at midnight. Then it occurred to me to come over the way and haunt this place a little. I felt that if I ever got a hearing I must succeed, for I had the most efficient company that perdition could furnish. Night after night we have shivered around through these mildewed halls, dragging chains, groaning, whispering, tramping up and down stairs, till, to tell you the truth, I am almost worn out. But when I saw a light in your room tonight, I roused my energies again and went at it with a deal of the old freshness. But I am tired out, entirely fagged out. Give me, I beseech you, give me some hope. I lit off my perch in a burst of excitement and exclaimed, This transcends everything that ever did occur. Why, you poor, blundering old fossil, you have had all your trouble for nothing. You have been haunting a plaster cast of yourself. The real Cardiff Giant is in Albany. A fact. The original fraud was ingeniously and fraudfully duplicated and exhibited in New York as the only genuine Cardiff Giant, to the unspeakable disgust of the owners of the real Colossus, at the very same time that the latter was drawing crowds at a museum in Albany. Confound it! Don't you know your own remains? I never saw such an eloquent look of shame, of pitiable humiliation, overspread a countenance before. The petrified man rose slowly to his feet and said, Honestly, is that true? As true as I am sitting here. He took the pipe from his mouth and laid it on the mantel, then stood irresolute a moment, unconsciously from old habit, thrusting his hands where his pantaloon pockets should have been, and meditatively dropping his chin on his breast, and finally said, Well, I never felt so absurd before. The petrified man has sold everybody else, and now the mean fraud has ended by selling its own ghost. My son, if there is any charity left in your heart for a poor friendless phantom like me, don't let this get out. Think how you would feel if you had made such an ass of yourself. I heard his stately tramp die away, step by step down the stairs and out into the deserted street, and felt sorry that he was gone, poor fellow, and sorrier still that he had carried off my red blanket and my bathtub. What did you think of the story? Wasn't it kind of silly how our narrator wasn't afraid of this ghost, but an unknown or any other ghost he was absolutely terrified? The way that Mark Twain poked fun at this ghost had me asking so many questions. Like, why? I felt like I was missing some context, and it turns out that I was. And that missing context brings us to today's topic, the Cardiff Giant. And yes, it's a real thing. So our story goes back to October 16th of 1869. A man named Gideon Emmons had been living a really difficult life. He had lost his left arm in the Battle of Gravelly Run. He really struggled with his recovery. And in fact, he actually turned to alcohol for comfort. But he woke up early that day so that he could hike to Newell's farm. William, also known as Stub Newell, hired him to help dig a well. He didn't find anything suspicious about this request, as he was taking any job he could get. That way he could follow his regular routine. He arrived at Newell's farm where he met Henry Nichols, who was also hired to dig the well. Nichols was actually Newell's brother-in-law. They began digging at the site Newell marked, and around 11 a.m. they struck something hard within the soil. Upon inspection, they saw what appeared to be a giant, petrified foot amongst the clay. And I quote, "I declare, some old Indian has been buried here," end quote, one of them exclaimed. Before we get too excited, our story actually begins a couple years before we meet Mr. Emmons. In 1867 Iowa, there was an argument between a preacher and an atheist. Shocker! It started as a theological debate with Methodist preacher Henry B. Turk, who had a literalist belief of the Bible. When asked if that belief included the book of Genesis, where it talked of giants roaming the earth, Turk affirmed the Bible to be true, and therefore giants did exist in those times, per the Bible. This did not sit well with our atheist, a man named George Hull. Hull was a man of many talents. He was a known swindler and made a living as a horse trader, card cheat, and cigar maker. He wanted to be a tobacco tycoon. People questioned if he was illiterate or to believe his claims of being a reader of Hume. That night, Hull lay awake. He was baffled anyone would believe in the giants of the Bible, and this got him to thinking. Could one fool the faithful with a stone giant and pass it off as a petrified man? If done right, this sham would be a blow against religion, and he might make a little money. He stewed a bit more before deciding he was going to try to fool the world. Hull traveled to Fort Dodge, Iowa, with a man named H.B. Martin to obtain a 5-ton block of gypsum. His request seemed a little suspicious to the locals, and so he came up with the story that the gypsum block was for a statue of the late President Lincoln. He had the block shipped to a marble dealer in Chicago, who was also in on the plan for a cut of the profits. Our marble dealer hired a pair of marble cutters to sculpt our masterpiece in the summer of 1868. Our marble cutters were Mr. Frederick Morman and Henry Sall. Hull posed as the model because why wouldn't a man who decided he was going to fool the world have an ego that big? So, the attention to detail of our cutters was remarkable. This statue was of Hull posed naked, and they even carved his curls. When Hull saw his statue, he wanted to make sure that his giant looked as authentic as possible. So he met with a local geographer, who confirmed that the curls would not fossilize. Hull returned, and he had the curls cut from the statue, yet it still looked too new. Hull actually drove pins into the body to help mimic the pores in the skin. And he had the carvers use ink and sulfuric acid to help give an aged and eroded appearance to this statue. When completed, the giant stood 10 feet tall and weighed about 3,000 pounds. Now Hull had almost all the pieces of his plan together. Now he just needed the right place to bury his art. He searched around across the United States, and he ended up choosing Cardiff, New York, for a couple reasons. So he chose Newell's farm, probably due to familial ties, because a man who marries his 16-year-old niece, in his 30s, guys, of course he's going to pick somebody in the family to help. But Cardiff was also known for fossil deposits. Fossils have been discovered there quite regularly, so it only made sense. And Cardiff and the surrounding area had Native American legends of stone giants who had conquered their ancestors' homeland, so it all tied together. Newell was cut into the deal and sworn to secrecy. Hull shipped his giant to Newell's property in a sealed box. In November of 1868, they buried the giant near Newell's barn and wedged it under tree roots, trying to give the appearance that the giant had been there for many years. Now that the location was settled and the giant was in his earthy bed, Hull returned home in nearby Birmingham and busied himself with his work. Almost a year would pass before Hull wrote to Newell and let him know it was time to unearth the Colossus. News of the discovery flew through Cardiff. Men left their work and women grabbed their children, so they say, and all traveled to the site of the discovery. People thought the wonder was an ancient man who had been petrified by the waters of a nearby swamp. A lecturer who happened to be passing through said it was not a man, but a statue, carved by French Jesuits centuries ago. As speculation continued, Newell played his part of humble farmer to a T, and he even offered to rebury the giant and forget all about this nonsense. He was convinced by his neighbors the find may have historical value. News spread and began making headlines, such as a new wonder or a singular discovery, which kept drawing the crowds as everyone flocked to see the marble. As the crowds grew, Newell decided to use a white tent to cover the discovery so that he could begin charging 50 cents a head for admission. About 2,500 people came during the exhibition's first week alone, and as news spread, even more people came. And as more people traveled to see the find, Newell began to receive offers to buy the giant. Newell turned down all offers to buy until Hull arrived in Cardiff. They had a quick powwow, a quick little discussion to decide, and they opted to sell to a business syndicate for $30,000. And they sold a 3/4 stake to that syndicate. More experts came to inspect the wonder over the next few weeks, such as New York State geologist James Hall and Rochester University professor Henry Ward, who both supported the statue theory. Still, there were those who believed in the petrified man hypothesis. Why? Why on earth would anyone believe in the petrified man? Well, in the 1850s, the newspapers back then reported strange findings, and it was an age where scientific discovery was fascinating and people knew just enough to cause a little trouble. So there had actually been news stories of petrification in the news prior to this, including the most famous case in 1850 of a Georgia woman's corpse. It was supposed to be rehomed, moved to a different location, And when they went to move her, the movers couldn't move the coffin at all. When they opened it, they'd found that it was filled with water and she'd turned to stone. Well, if you know about the fossilization process, what was happening was natural decomposition and the organic materials were being replaced by minerals. And so that was usually what their petrification cases were back then. Or since they didn't really understand body decomposition, as you lose the fluids, the skin kind of becomes more leathery and, well, people were mistaking that for stone. However, there were those back then who were suspicious regarding the authenticity of the find, because locals remembered seeing Hull transport a very large sealed crate through Cardiff that last year, and reporters discovered that Newell had transferred a large sum of money to Hull right after selling the Giant. Now, our new owners took possession of the Colossus and continued exhibitions in Syracuse and Albany, where it was seen by a mining engineer who created quite a stir when he noted that gypsum would have deteriorated quickly in the wet, soggy soil of Newell's farm. And Yale paleontologist Othniel Charles Marsh barely glanced at the Giant and pronounced it to be, and I quote, of very recent origin and a most decided humbug, end quote. Despite the reveal of fraud, people still wanted to see it, which meant many people, well, a select few people, saw dollar signs that could be made. In fact, the infamous P.T. Barnum saw the Giant after Marsh's inspection and offered to buy it. And when they declined, he turned around and offered $60,000 for a 3-month lease, which was also rejected by the owners. And so, not to let this opportunity go, Barnum commissioned a sculptor to build him a replica out of plaster that he displayed as the real thing. His flyers actually played on the hoax and authenticity of it all. They would say, the real Cardiff Giant, or, is it fake? Is it a statue? Come see it. And his advertising drew great crowds and even outsold the original Giant when it finally arrived in New York that December. Now, the man who built Barnum's forgery, he saw that he could make some more money. So he actually made more copies, more replicas, and soon several were shown around the country as the real Cardiff Giant. In 1870, our Cardiff Giant went from fascination to ridicule with like a hint of fondness, because the ruse was crumbling. Hull had actually begun to publicly brag about his accomplishment. And the first president of Cornell University, Andrew D. White, discovered there was no legitimate reason to dig a well where Newell had requested. And then the final nail in the coffin. Newspapers printed written confessions from the Chicago marble cutters in February of 1870. Now, the Cardiff Giant didn't just fade away. He continued to be displayed by American Goliath proprietors for a few years as crowds dwindled. In 1880, he was condemned to a storage barn in Massachusetts. And then it continued to exchange hands. It passed from owner to owner and toured the carnival circuit for a while. Now it is currently on display at the New York Historical Society's Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York, if you want to go take a look at the world's most famous hoax, at least in the United States. And if you're also interested in Barnum's reproduction of the Cardiff Giant, it is believed to be displayed at Marvin's Marvelous Mechanical Museum. Personally, I would recommend going to both just because they have a lot of really cool stuff there. It's not just the Giants, but that's just me. So, how much did Hull actually end up making from this hoax? So the man spent about $2,600 to make the Giant, have it moved and buried. And so, if you recall, they sold a 3/4 stake for $30,000. So they estimate that he cleared around $20,000 Because don't forget, he had all those different partners along the way that he split the profit with. And he actually tried to continue his career in flimflammery after this. It made him bolder. In 1877, he actually attempted another hoax with a 7-foot-tall giant with a tail that he buried in Colorado. It was very quickly exposed. Shocker, common sense says that after everything that had happened, the world isn't gonna be fooled that easily again. And he actually lost a fortune in that endeavor. He died in 1902, still proud of fooling the world. So I guess that just goes to show that it's better to be a good person. I mean, you could lie to the world and make a quick buck for a short amount of time, but you're gonna lose it all. So, did you already know about the story of the Cardiff Giant? Or were you like me where you just learned about it because Mark Twain said just enough in his ghost story to make you wonder, why are we talking that way? Because he was so fond and laughing of it. Because with that story, I know I wouldn't have been afraid of that giant either. Well, the ghost. I definitely wouldn't have been afraid of that ghost. So, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to find me again later if you liked the story. And don't forget to share with someone you know that you think will also enjoy the podcast. Be kind and be smart out there, guys. Talk to you later. Bye.